if there are any. Yes.
Well, I just want to thank all of the panelists. I had a question, Dominic, that was just mind-blowing to me, and the image of Strom Thurmond just hanging out in the Senate chambers, showing some factual things, because this is so new to me. He shows Flaming Creatures. The other three films he just throws in for a good old boy time? Or was it also to argue a case?
I think it was just a common occurrence in the sense that it's an attempt to strip the work of any sort of particularities, social or cultural context, and just to say it's mere pornography, which I think happens. I mean, so I cited the 94 proposals from Helms, which does a pretty similar thing. I find it kind of interesting the sort of the relations that get set up so sort of easily, because I mean actually the relations between the four works that I very quickly showed you of the early 90s are quite complicated actually, to try and assume the relations between them. Mm-hmm. But a kind of a conservative position likes to, as Jonathan has shown in another essay, that there's a sort of uneasy conflation that is not interrogated. So I think the Fortis Film Festival was another mode with a different effect to the one that Jonathan discusses elsewhere, but it's attempting a similar strategy.
And because I don't know anything about Jack Smith, can you just give me some, because we enter this with the film, but who was he? Was he just some biographical information? Just get a sense of who he was. And thank you.
I mean, so the sort of the basic overview would be that he was born in 1932 in Ohio and arrived in New York in 1956 via Los Angeles and Chicago, and he made a few films in the late 50s, including some collaborations with Ken Jacobs, and then made his first kind of major film in 62, and which was shown in 63. And he was so appalled by its reception that he kind of made a counter film, which he thought was going to be, he called it a pasty novelty, kind of in pink and green, this a brilliant film called Normal Love, and then just refused to finish it and refused to sort of offer up another film to be abused. And he made a few more films, but by the sort of mid to late 60s had decided to commit himself to performance and would perform most weekends at midnight in his loft to very few audience members. And I think that was the way he liked it. And, was a sort of, I mean, he's a famously difficult character, happily burnt his bridges. He used to say that his best situation was to not go onto stage onto his performance space for 3 or 4 hours after the organized time, scheduled time, which often for a performance that hadn't been advertised, so that he could weed his audience down to its most receptive core, which might be, two people, and with the performance would go on for several hours until until no one was left. And so he's an interestingly difficult character. And then he carried on making work until the late 80s, until a few weeks before he died in September 1989. And then there's a very interesting kind of after narrative as well, in that his archive was saved by Penny Arcade, a New York-based performance artist, and then there was a court battle, and it now is owned by the Gladstone Gallery. And there's fantastic papers stored there.
This is sort of a question for Jonathan Katz, and I guess it's a question from within the family, because obviously we and all of us, or many of us here, are very pro looking at queer issues, et cetera, right? And I thought your paper was amazingly subtle and wonderful, particularly when you're talking about Agnes Martin's own paintings. But I guess I got most worried when several times you referred to her as a closeted lesbian, and it made me think about how the issue of repression, which you're sort of, how I worried that if one places lesbianism at the core of what is being, let's say, not, I don't know if repression is the right word, but is not being seen on the surface of the pictures, but is about this process of abstraction. Why lesbian? Why not man, woman, for example? Why not Democrat, Republican? Why not, I mean, why not the idea of identity and self in all of its multiplicity? I just found it strange, and particularly as, again, I guess one of my other worries is one of the things that homophobic readings do, and it did, for example, an artist like Charles Demuth, who I studied so much, there was a kind of idea code where they would, in some strange way, claim, even as they were not investigating the gay subject matter in his work, that somehow it seeps in everywhere, that the work is always gay, even when he's doing pictures of buildings or flowers. It's everywhere. It's always there in gay work, while somehow straight artists evade that somehow. They aren't controlled by their sexuality. And so I worry about the Agnes Martin idea that somehow all those subtle binaries and all those things you were talking about somehow get sort of placed on the level of her identity in relationship to lesbianism. And I thought maybe you could
Sure,
address that.
I'd be happy to address that because I think it cuts to the core of what I'm arguing. And I'm arguing, in fact, contrary to what you're saying, that lesbianism is, in fact, defined as the central problem, precisely because it is that which must always be disavowed. That's why I use the term closeted lesbian. And the reason that I see this as central is that all the other binaries that you note are binaries that are instated in culture, are normative binaries. But what I'm arguing animates, ultimately, Martin's art is a desire to create an irresolvable binary held in stasis that is a kind of a pure perceptual experience, which is without history, without context. In other words, one of those rare moments where in daily life we can be like Nietzsche's cow and escape history, escape all that wears us down, and achieve the kind of transcendence that her art was after. And I really do believe in the way that, for example, she created a Zen garden for 7 years, right? That she was after those rare moments when you can step out of history, step out of all that wears and grinds you down for a kind of pure attentiveness, a pure sensual attentiveness, which separates you from all of that and allows you to go forward.
But just, one last response to that. Here I am an out queer person, and that sounds really, really good to me. Like I can't imagine anything more wonderful, and surely it's not because I want to escape, the realization that I'm a queer person, right? So do you see the problem with that?
No, I don't actually, because for me, it's notable. I mean, she's often been, for example, conflated with the minimalists. And whereas the minimalists have a defined and decided structure to their work, in which one ponders the given, shall we agree, her work is always about immanence, about becoming. And I think it's fair to say, and this is, I mean, you and I can argue about this, right. But I think that this idea of endorsing and embracing the moment of pure becoming before things get settled and stabilized, which is for her the definition of freedom, is born of an attempt to escape the settled social histories she found herself in.
I have a question. My name's Nathaniel Siegel, and my question is for Dr. James Boaden. In your presentation, you implied that Allen Ginsberg was not welcome in the home of Robert Duncan and Jess. I believe that Allen Ginsberg read Howl for the first time in San Francisco? And is it a question of him not staying in that specific home? Because later on in life, Robert Duncan and Allen Ginsberg toured universities in the United States. They were quite close, quite friendly. So the suggestion that they weren't welcome in that home doesn't say anything that they weren't friends or colleagues.
No, I wouldn't want to imply that at all. I mean, if you heard the quotation is that Duncan isn't there when this occurs, that he turns up at the house with Peter. And that then Jess says, I don't want you to come in, and this causes a big kind of hoo-ha. But Ginsberg, at that point, is in contact with Duncan because Duncan is running this poetry center where he's inviting
Correct.
Ginsberg to come and speak. I mean, what's presented in Howl, which is the same year that this incident occurs, is a very different kind of idea of sexuality, but it's one that's very close to lots of other people in Duncan's circle, like Jack Spicer, for example, is a real example of this kind of dissident sexuality. And I think it's interesting that Duncan is somebody that keeps all of these things up in the air, neither coming down on one side or the other, and talks about this a great deal in his verse. I don't want to imply that he's sort of keeping Ginsberg to one side, but just rather to say that the home is a very different kind of space to the one that's represented in Ginsberg's poetry. And for Jess, Ginsberg was somebody that wasn't welcome. And Jess and Duncan are not the same person, which is very important, even though they share this kind of ethos of the home. I hope that answers. Does that answer your question?
It does answer my question. I just wanted to clarify for the audience
Yeah, sure.
that Robert Duncan and Jess's, their private home, there were a lot of scenes out there in San Francisco, including Helen Adams. So for them to have this kind of sacred space that was their own didn't mean that their lives didn't intersect, that they weren't comfortable being around one another, that they didn't, again, have an affinity for each other. So I just wanted to clarify.
Yeah, sure.
Thanks.
Yes, please.
May I come back to the question, Jonathan, that Jonathan Weinberg posed to you and that you responded to? When you speak of Agnes Martin looking for a way to move beyond the historical flux, move out of it, become free of it, which presumably means that the viewer of her paintings is also invited, drawn to move out. I certainly, that rings true to my experience of her paintings. I lose myself. It's a little bit, as you notice more and more of the delicate but very strong, fluid but permanent tensions. It's like late Bach, where you just forget where you are. But that to me is not a place to stay. And I don't think it's humane to want to escape history and one's responsibilities. If one did, one wouldn't have access to Agnes Martin's paintings. They wouldn't be collected by people who are involved in this messy, and in view of this conference, very messy situation. So couldn't you say something more about what it means to be transcendently involved in history? Is her gift adequate to our situation, or doesn't one have to criticize the extent to which it is escape? Isn't there a responsibility to come back, even for the reasons that she wanted to escape? We can't settle for that, I would think.
Very good question, and of course I'm in complete agreement. I mean, in some sense, I do the very obverse of escaping from history as my life's work, and I do agree that that escapist impulse is not sustainable, nor is it particularly productive. But I also wanted, and this was really my sole point, I wanted to restore to those works and more broadly, to make a broader claim about abstraction, that one could get beyond the delimited frame of depicted bodies in talking about sexuality and art, and begin to see sexuality in the complex way that it animates all forms of art making, art creation, and so that we can begin to realize a queer art history which is as rich and as varied and as complicated as all forms, all accounts of art making, and not purely a mimetic one. But I do agree with your political critique, and I also find Martin's escapist impulses rather hard to separate from something that I have actually repressed in my account of her, because I don't yet know how to talk about it, and that is her nervous breakdown and subsequent battle with mental illness all her life. She talks about how, as she puts it, sometimes inspiration grips you, and then desperation hits, and she says, I've broken quite a few rocking chairs in that. And so you think, wow, okay. So there's something profound there, but as yet I don't know how to access it.
And one of the questions, as you do, I would think would be, to what degree is this human more generally and inclusively, and to what degree is this focally her sexuality?
And that's absolutely, the question is whether it's sort of proper to see this as focally her sexuality or just part of her general humanness. And I think the ratio of sort of this, which Jonathan also points to, is very important. I do, however, as a social historian, never want to underestimate the extraordinary burden of living an unacknowledged social dissidence at the heart of the Lavender Scare. Yes.
Hi, my question is for Dominic. I was wondering if you could expand a little bit on Jack Smith's relationship to the New American Cinema and underground cinema movements in New York in the 60s. And specifically what I was curious about is that it seems to me in critical remembrances of the era, Flaming Creatures is cited as this inspirational and originary text. And yet, so I found your talk very helpful. I want to thank you for it, because your the spectrum of disgust that you articulated, I think could be helpful for us in trying to establish why Flaming Creatures has been bracketed off from, say, the way that the Kuchar brothers use disgust, or John Waters, or Stan Brakhage for that matter. But I wanted to hear your opinion or your thoughts on their disgust versus his, if you have any.
Great. It's a great question. So firstly, the first part, how does Jack Smith sit within the history of the New American Cinema in the 1960s? I mean, he has a very paradoxical position in that he's absolutely central and oddly marginal to it, so that Flaming Creatures is absolutely crucial to the way in which Jonas Mekas kind of characterizes the New American Cinema and its, the direction in which it should persist in 1962, 3, 4. But then Jack Smith very quickly refuses the kind of reading that Jonas Mekas is giving in the bizarre, quixotic way in which Jack Smith ever does anything, and then to the extent that Jonas Mekas becomes in Jack Smith's kind of lexicon of images becomes the driving force, a nemesis essentially. So, for 20, 30 years after, he's got all these performances which are basically about the way in which Jonas Mekas apparently ruined his career, destroyed his, his beautiful film, and etc. So he has this very odd position in the New American Cinema. And so more generally, how does he relate to other filmmakers? I mean, I think I'm very interested in this idea that you start to say about how he's a kind of typical example in histories of film. But interestingly, at the same time, he's completely outside of the histories of visual culture and to a certain extent of performance as well. That's starting to change a little bit now. But you know, when I started the project, it was very frustrating to see that, you know, whenever you looked in the back of a, I don't know, those sort of art, contemporary art after 1945 or something, he was never there. And if Jack Smith wasn't in the index, it was the sort of hideous 1950s British kitchen sink painter Jack Smith. And so I found that interesting, and that actually became a kind of spur to thinking about Jack Smith in a different way, for actually trying to theorize the reasons why he might necessarily fall outside of the histories of visual culture after 1960. So that, you know, it would be very easy actually to reinsert him in, but it's not really the kind of strategy that I'm interested in. So it would be easy to reinsert him by saying, well, actually Warhol is crucial, so Warhol very clearly learned lots of techniques and was very explicit about learning how to make films, learning how to exploit boredom, learning how to have a factory. We're all kind of copied or learnt from Jack Smith, but I think for me what's much more interesting is thinking, well, if he plays with disgust, if he plays with discomfort, if he plays with duration, if he plays with awkwardness, all these sort of tropes which we can see in other artists' work, he does it in what I see as a kind of distinctly unpalatable way. So in the difference between him and John Waters is there's a very different relation to camp, I think, where he retains the kind of the morbid, obsessive, scary quality of camp, which I think John Waters maybe doesn't. Or so, you know, there's different. I think there's nuanced ways of separating him out from the history to sort of argue, as I say, the reasons why he necessarily must fall out of those histories. And to reinsert him will unsettle the narratives as they're constituted.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Andre?
Thank you. A question for the panel as a whole. I'm trying to figure out what image of queer art at mid-century emerged from the panel as a whole, which I guess was the objective of putting the three papers together. And it strikes me that one way of putting it, and I would like to hear what you have to say about it, is that this is the moment where queer artists start to kidnap, appropriate, embrace the discourses that have once been used against them. So here's Jess claiming the anachronic fully for himself. Here's Agnes Martin claiming inversion for herself. And here's Jack Smith claiming perversion for himself. So first part of my question has to do with, A, do you agree with that assessment of what happens in the 1950s? And B, why does that happen then? And secondly, I want to ask you how successful such a strategy can be if it comes in such obviously borrowed stylistic terms, because Jess is such an explicit late surrealist, right? And the styles that they are all using are not necessarily a queer style at all. Same for Agnes Martin, right? She comes at a pretty late moment in the history of abstraction where that style is not at all a queer style. And the same for Smith, who sits very squarely in our histories of abjection, right? And the informe, which are so much longer histories than he embodies. So if the three of you would respond to those two questions, I'd appreciate it.
I mean, I could say something very quickly, which I think your reading sounds wonderful. But I wonder there's something quite exciting about putting Jack Smith next to Agnes Martin. And I think what I take as being exciting about Jonathan's paper is about how the kind of the traditional or the kind of the convenient binaries start to fall apart. And I think that, for example, Agnes Martin is neither. It would be unfair to ask Jonathan to decide whether she's conservative or progressive. And I think that for example, and I think what's happening is that sort of those convenient binaries start to fall apart, and I think maybe that's what happens at mid-century. And it may well be related to what you're saying, that by appropriating the terms, we can set up continuums or spectrums and and a political position can sort of shuttle between the conservative and the progressive, between the pleasurable and embracing pleasure, embracing disgust, between closetedness and, you know, being out, or whatever the sort of the convenient oppositions might be. And I think that sounds in and of itself as a kind of a useful invention. Just to have, and it's also a kind of a utopian position, I guess, where you just set up a tension between contrasting terms and see that as a kind of way forward, rather than choosing one at the expense of the other, with all the kind of demonizing strategies that are involved when you choose one position over another. Maybe.
Just a little word on belated surrealism, which I don't. A word about belated surrealism, which is a term that I'm not particularly interested in for looking at Jess, because I don't think that surrealism ends in 1939, as the textbook tells you it does. I mean, throughout American art, there's a really long tradition surrounding surrealism in the 1940s, which Jess and Duncan both fall into a kind of tradition of. So I don't think there's any kind of recuperation of an aesthetic or something that's disappeared and that they're kind of attaching themselves to, but actually imbricating themselves in a queer tradition, which happens through something like View magazine, set up by Charles Henry Ford and Parker Tyler. And actually kind of looking at that as a kind of lineage is quite interesting in terms of what I'm arguing about, trying to kind of build into a kind of a story, build into a much longer past, make a kind of tradition in a very different kind of a way.
And if I can just quickly make a social historical point, and I'll do it very economically, one of the arguments that I was trying to make in the exhibition upstairs is that the 1950s, emblematized in some sense by the great Paul Cadmus, What I Believe, is a moment in which finally you have a beginning of what we are now familiar with, which is the cleaving of gay from straight and the construction of a kind of binary worldview, which was absolutely not operative prior to that historical moment, that it was the Lavender Scare and the World War II moment that really begins what we now understand as a kind of binary construction. So of course, if one sees, right, the beginning of a binary construction of gay from straight, that one would also see beginnings of modes of resistance that use an opposition to that polarity as their defining aesthetic trope. Yes?
In a way, I feel like my question is identical to the previous one, just not as articulately put. In the sense that as I'm hearing this discussion and trying to synthesize these amazing papers, I think in terms of Zen, to the practitioner of Zen in this period, who I am most familiar with, who's John Cage, and I wonder, Dr. Katz, if you have thoughts or designs on taking this sort of mode of Zen analysis to Cage in his work, sort of laterally, but then as someone who's guilty of regularly conflating Martin's work with minimalism, at least as a viewer, I also wonder if there's this sense, I mean, I feel in terms of minimalism, there's this removal of the artist's gesture, which is sort of in opposition to Agnes Martin's, you know, very precise and persistent gesture with her hand and her mark. And I wonder if, and then I think immediately of somebody like Felix Gonzalez-Torres, who has reached back and retooled or appropriated the language of minimalism. And I wonder if there's sort of a new forward trajectory, perhaps, of this mode of I guess, a binary or an opposition that you see going into minimalism and beyond.
Sure. Well, first, vis-a-vis John Cage, not widely known, but I wrote an article about precisely that issue called John Cage's Queer Silence, which is about Zen and John Cage. And one of the things that I say in John Cage's Queer Silence is that actually, unlike Agnes Martin, we have documentation of the rationale that animates Cage's turn towards Zen, because he says, I had a personal problem attendant upon my divorce from Xenia. He's moving in, of course, with Merce Cunningham. And he says, and I went to psychology, I went to the church, I went to various experts. And in other words, I went to the authoritative traditions And he said, and they had nothing to say to me. And then I found D.T. Suzuki, and although I don't know why I kept going to those presentations at Columbia University, they were profoundly important for what I became. And I mean, it's flat out there. In terms of the sort of use of Zen in contemporary terms, I think there's an interesting difference with Felix Gonzalez Torres and others, simply in the fact that at a moment when, let me say a difference and a sameness, at a moment when it was quite possible to articulate publicly sexual difference, a resurgent right retooled the norms of the museum world and the art world, and I'm of course referring to, say, the Mapplethorpe brouhaha, such that even though you wanted to bespeak identity, you could not. And so there's a kind of re-emergence of the terms of negotiating constraint in the late 1980s and early 1990s, which I think gives new impetus to this mode.
We have Josh. I just wanted to pick up a little bit on what I take to be a strain in a few of the questions. And so this is partly, I think, framed first, Jonathan, as a question for you, but which I also take to pick up on the question about disgust in Smith as compared to in other films in the period. So it may be a question that's sort of open in general to the panel. But my attention was caught, Jonathan, when you said in response to an earlier question that you would like to be part of opening a moment in which art history of gay aesthetics and its relationship to gay identity wouldn't have to be mimetic, that it undergirds kind of pictorial practice in general. And of course, I feel really sympathetic to that as a gesture and as an idea of a kind of opening to a certain kind of possibility. But it opens onto a secondary question from my point of view, which is how you, another kind of possibility that seems to me we might be at the cusp of, which is how you integrate a gay art history with other kinds of art history at the same time. And one way to put that question, or to give that question some kind of specifics, would be to say, well, how do you do the next step with talking about Agnes Martin's abstraction? How do you talk about Martin's abstraction in relationship, let's say, to Donald Judd's paintings of 1959, 60, 61, which have, it seems to me, could be argued, this very same kind of unresolved dialectics in them, or Frank Stella's, or, I mean, and this sort of picks up, I think, a little bit on something you were saying, Andre, the much longer history of abstraction, even, let's say, Mondrian. And I just wonder if you could say a little bit about the degree to which this unresolved dialectic is specifically queer, if you think it is, and how that opens into a kind of broader practical question for the future of gay art history.
Sure.
Which is how to handle that kind of problem in general.
Sure. No, I think it's a great question. And I would answer it this way. In some sense, I'm a very old-fashioned art historian, and so I take what artists say about their work not as gospel. I often find that they do exactly the obverse of what they claim, but I always consider it. And I'm struck by the fact that there is perhaps no more sort of profoundly framed artist, by her own words, than Agnes Martin. Somebody who continuously is exhibited in terms of her own commentaries on the work. And those commentaries lead in a particular direction. Strikingly, the other figures that you mention, right, have very different, equally prevalent discursive contexts for their work. Stella, right, formalism. Judd's a little bit more complicated, but it's certainly not Zen. And so what I want to suggest is, yes, one of the great things about visuality is things can look like things. But one of the charges of an art historian is to pierce through that similarity and begin to tease out the discursive differences that animate these different projects. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense, although it sounds like a very particular kind of answer, which is in a way to say, oh, despite visual similarities, I'm really saying that this abstraction, it may look like what Donald Judd's doing at the same time, but it really is a queer abstraction, and what Donald Judd's doing isn't.
Can I jump in here? Because as a feminist art historian, I'm starting to go a little mad, right? Because there are other ways of placing. I loved your talk. I thought it was brilliant and really elegant and also kind of juicy. The big O was a lovely way to bring around a discussion around Agnes Martin, but there are also ways of placing her in art history, which is in relationship to the feminist art history that comes after her, or in relationship to the contemporary lesbian artists who are making abstract work right now, like Ronnie Horn, for example, whom I found myself thinking about very persistently while looking at this work, or Susan Silton, or Linda Bessemer. I mean, we could sit here and rattle off the names of women who are very much strongly identified with contemporary lesbian art practices, who make rigorously abstract work, and who are in aggressive dialogue with the masculinist presumptions of discourse about minimalism, right? And that's an explicit part of all of their practices. You don't have to look far for that. So, you know, I've been getting a little bit agitated because that we have to put her in relationship to Stella to somehow make sense of what Jonathan was saying in terms of art history. It seems to be exactly the kind of problem that this symposium is, it's like we don't want to be replicating that as somehow the burden of what we need to be doing as critics in order to actually have a conversation about the queerness of Agnes Martin's paintings.
Would it be okay? I'll just say something quickly and then I'll sit down because I know time is short. But I would say my understanding of what was just said is antithetical to what I meant my question to open on to, which is precisely the way of synthesizing versions of accounting for pictures and trying to put them in relationship to each other rather than finding that there is some kind of master story, which is exactly, incidentally, where I also feel sympathy to the talk. But anyway, it's a larger question about whether there's, what the possibility is in the near future for this kind of,
Thank you.
yeah, kind of work.
Oh, one more question.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk, all three of you. It was great.
Thank you.
I'm Rafael Cañizares Yunes, a queer artist. And so I'm wondering how, as historians, you look at the process of a personal identity and in context, whatever context that is, and how, as artists, we choose to archive certain things, present them. And then we separate that to the discussions we have about it. And I find that sometimes those discussions, which you mentioned, Jonathan, are separate from the actual work. We kind of, whether to protect or codify for creating linkages, we choose to present or not. So we have the personal, how we present it, how do we codify it, archive it in a certain way, and then how that is at the same time interpreted, which then influences how other people see themselves personally. So in that cycle, in that process, can we discern history and present almost like an accurate portrayal of our history?
You guys want to do it? Okay.
I think really when you're thinking about what artists can archive themselves and the way that, this concentration on the individual that you have there is kind of makes me think, wow, you wish, The artists who I work on, a lot of them have these archives where they kind of threw things away and left things and lost things. And it's actually what interests me is a whole kind of mesh of how people kind of come together into a practice, the audience looking at it, as well as the artist and all of the kind of groups that surround them, which makes this whole kind of idea of building an archive into something else for the making of history anyway.
I'm sorry, I'm being misunderstood. I was using archival metaphorically.
Yeah.
So archival as in what I choose to make. Mm-hmm. Not necessarily how I catalog my work and what I talk about my work, but actually what is manifested, what is presented. Agnes's work, that's archival. That's what she's choosing to present to us, and how we use that.
Yeah,
to
yeah,
talk
and
about art
I
history.
think I'm answering that question by saying that there are so many other things out there way beyond what's kind of there being presented, and that's kind of what I'm trying to look for in my work anyway. Jonathan, no.
Well, and I just wanted to say that, you know, the thing I like about being an art historian is that I find artists are very good liars. And as a consequence, one of the responsibilities is to sort of pierce through what is being said about a work in favor of what is precisely not being said about a work, because, of course, I often find, particularly in my neck of the woods, that what's not being said is the most compelling and most interesting. And the reliance, and one of my great critiques of dominant art history is its sort of unabashed reliance on what artists say, of course, especially when what they say conveniently replicates structures of exclusion and oppression. And so we routinely, as the Robert Rauschenberg retrospective at the Museum of Modern Art, at the Met did recently, regale audiences with the fact that Rauschenberg married and that you know, he was the father of a son. What didn't appear in that same exhibition was his profound and by far more defining relationship with both Cy Twombly and Jasper Johns. And I think that it is the beginning of a new art history when we can actually articulate these kinds of dissident histories, these escaped histories, these, to take Gavin Butt's words, to make gossip the ground in some instances, because it's the form of unauthorized knowledge, for a dissident account of these works. Did you want to say something? Thank you all. We're going to take a 15-minute break, and we'll be back.